Welcome to Dungeon Academics. My name is Thomas, and I will be your instructor. I like talking about game mechanics, and whilst there are lots and lots of amazing Dungeons and Dragons creators on YouTube, a lot of them talk about gameplay, character builds, using monsters, dungeon mastering tips. But when they do talk about game mechanics, I'm extra happy because this is part of the conversation that I really want to be part of as well. And I was lucky because two dungeon tubers, I think that's the term, that I follow made some amazing videos about on the same mechanic, and I'd love to be part of this conversation as well. So, firstly, I want to talk about Only Crits. He did a great video, Why Do Weapons in D&D Suck? Now, this is something that I've talked about extensively in previous videos, and he came at it with a slightly different approach that I really appreciate. The idea that he had is that weapons deal bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, and it really doesn't matter which one they deal because it's effectively all the same. Things that are resistant to one of those types of damage are normally resistant to all of them or none of them. There's only a handful of things that are vulnerable to one and not all of them. And so really, the difference between bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing is negligible. The number of cases in which you want to do one over the other is absolutely tiny. So it doesn't matter which one you pick because they're almost all the same. I would say that there's a little bit more to this because with the introduction of things like the slasher, crusher, and piercer feat, these are abilities that trigger on one particular damage type alone. That the sort of meta build is more important than the actual weapon yourself. Whether you pick a bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing weapon doesn't depend on which type of damage you want to do. It depends on which additional rule you want to add to the damage. Now, I'm a big fan of damage and mechanics for combat in Dungeons and Dragons. I think a weapon should be defined not just by the damage that it does, but by the additional effects that it can do. And that can be what differentiates different weapons. For example, a halberd and a glaive are the same weapon. They have the same weight, the same abilities, the same damage and damage type. They just have a different name, so there's two entries on the list. If a glaive and a halberd had different extra abilities added to them, then it would be fine having them as a different weapon. I think the 2024 Dungeons & Dragons weapon mastery rules are a step in the right direction, but as I've talked about in plenty of previous videos, I don't think it goes far enough. And currently I am writing a list of potential weapon masteries. I've got to 34, I think it is. The idea being that each weapon should have 3 or 4 different masteries attached to it, and you learn multiple masteries rather than all the masteries for one weapon, and then you can pick which weapons you want to use based on which masteries you have, and the masteries give you an additional effect that isn't just more or less damage. I think some of them might do more or less damage. But this is where I think I want to take this even further. I want characters to be swapping weapons. One thing you get in Dungeons and Dragons a lot is a build around a weapon. Like this build is for using a two-handed axe. It's got a feat that only works with slashing damage. It's got feats that only work for heavy weapons, and therefore this is the weapon that you're going to use. And even if you found a great weapon that was of a different type, you wouldn't want to use it because your build is so specialized for this one weapon. I don't like that at the moment. It's one of the things about Dungeons and Dragons. You build for a weapon, and I don't like that lack of flexibility. I can understand why it exists, but I think it's detrimental to gameplay, and changing the rules of the game so that you could use different weapons or be encouraged to use different weapons, I think that's important. I'm going to get back to that in a second. The other content creator I want to bring up is Monkey DM, who I think's brilliant, has got lots of interesting things to say, and he brought up that the damage vulnerabilities are very, very rare in the game. This is because they are. His thesis is this is because they primarily benefit wizards. For the reasons I've just mentioned, melee fighters and ranged fighters or martial classes normally don't swap between weapons. So they deal one particular damage type. If a target's vulnerable to that damage, great, you get a big bonus. If it's not, nothing. But wizards having a huge list of spells they can access, it's very easy for them to swap between damage types. So if they find an enemy that has a vulnerability, it's very easy to make sure that all their attacks target that vulnerability. In fact, if you're an Order of Scribes wizard, that's your special thing. You find someone that's vulnerable to acid, great, all your attacks can now do acid damage. And effectively, you've doubled the damage of already potentially the most powerful damage dealer in the party. This isn't wrong. I think the lack of flexibility for martial characters, being able to swap between bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, and not being able to do as much elemental damage as spellcasters is a problem. I'd like to rectify that. But I also think there's a problem with the vulnerability mechanic, and that is purely mathematical. So if you are resistant to a type of damage, you halve the damage done. That's nice and easy. If you're vulnerable to that type of damage, you double it. Mathematically, that's easy to work with, and mathematically easy to work with is really important in a roleplay game. But if we look at it in absolute terms, let's say a typical fireball does 28 damage. If you are resistant to fire damage, you only take 14 fire damage, and that's a change of 14 points of damage. If you're vulnerable to it, you take 56 points of damage, and that's plus 28. In absolute terms, vulnerability has twice the effect of resistance. One drops the damage by 14, the other increases it by 28. I think, mathematically, it would be better if vulnerability increased the damage by 50% rather than doubling it. But there we run into a mathematical problem because it requires players to stop and do a calculation every time they do damage and something is vulnerable to it. And even being a maths teacher who does recreational algebra, I'll bring this up in a second, that's not good. That stops the gameplay while someone gets out a calculator or does a quick mental calculation. Okay, sometimes it's going to be easy. If you do 60 points of damage and you want to increase it by 50%, 90 points, easy. But if someone does 84 damage, a lot of people are going to have to stop and work out what 50% of that is and then add that on, and we don't want that. So is there a better way to do vulnerability and resistance to damage? I was thinking about this. I had two ideas. The first one I thought was rerolls. If someone is resistant to a damage type, you can reroll the damage. If someone is vulnerable to it, the attacker can reroll the damage. Is that good? Well, mathematically, it's very easy. I think most people can intuitively look at a set of dice and go, these are the ones I want to reroll, whether they're trying to maximize or minimize the damage done. There is a very simple routine for that. If the damage is above half the number of sides on a face, you want to re-roll that if you're minimizing damage. And if the damage is less than half the number of faces, you want to re-roll that if you're trying to maximize damage. Mathematically, how does that work? Well, this is where my algebra came in. I just did 3 pages of recreational algebra, absolutely love it, and I determined that if you want to either re-roll the highest or lowest values on a dice, you change the average by the number of sides divided by 8. That's easy, it's n over 8. So if you are rolling a 6-sided dice and you want to re-roll 1s, 2s, and 3s, you increase the damage by 6/8. And if you want to re-roll 4, 5s, and 6, you decrease the damage by 6/8. That's 6/8 of 1 point of damage, not 6/8 of the total. This means that the change in damage does go up with the larger dice and down with the smaller dice. It is relatively small. And ultimately, I wasn't that happy with how that worked, because it's a relatively small change to damage. Increasing the damage of, say, a fireball to a vulnerable target would do 6 extra points of damage, and a resistant target would be 6 less damage. I don't think that's notable enough. So I was thinking, are there other ways of changing the damage? And the other thing you could do is change the dice. So, for example, Fireball does 8d6 damage. Against a resistant target, you could knock it down to 8d4 damage. That's really easy to do. Against a vulnerable target, you could knock it up to 8d8 damage. So just taking the damage dice up 1 step for vulnerable targets and down 1 step for for targets that have resistance, that's a really easy system to implement. It perhaps would be a little bit trickier if you had an area of effect spell like the Fireball, where some targets were resistant and some targets were not resistant. You'd have to roll separate damage rather than rolling once and applying it to everyone. But edge cases like that are comparatively rare. I think we can live with those. I think it would allow more vulnerabilities to be brought into the game. And a big point that Only Crits brought up is the fact that creatures aren't given vulnerabilities is what makes weapons the same and what makes weapon choice irrelevant. If more creatures had vulnerabilities, especially to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, then there would be situations where player characters would go, this might be my optimum weapon, but I'm using this one instead for this fight. And that's what we want to see. So changing the vulnerability and resistance rules and making vulnerability and resistance more common, especially for mundane damage, would massively improve the game, in my opinion. It would change the way fighters and martial characters think about their weapon loadout and would encourage people to use different weapons. Something that I'm working on at the moment, like I said, the combat system with lots and lots of different weapon masteries, it gets to the point where it would encourage players to deliberately split attacks with different weapons, pull out different weapons in the middle of the fight, maybe even put the boot in and make an unarmed attack. The idea being that you want to use as many different weapon masteries per turn, and that would encourage you to make attacks with different weapons because you get a bonus by using multiple weapon masteries and you can't use them all with a single weapon. So having this idea of flexibility and change being encouraged, I think makes combat more interesting. I think it makes building martial characters more interesting, and it makes different monsters more interesting to fight against. So for Only Crits and Monkey DM, thank you for bringing these great ideas in. I think that this is a really important discussion that game designers need to have. And because people in the community are having these discussions, the games designers for the next version of our favourite role-playing games should have some better ideas to work with. And, like I said before, if anyone wants to make me in charge of making Dungeons and Dragons, now you can see what I would do different and hopefully how I could make a better version of the game. Anyway, that's it for now. I have more things I want to talk about, but I'll probably put those in a different video. So, thank you for listening and enjoy your next game, whatever it may be.